So it's almost 8:30 and I got out of the shower, but I have an app idea that I want to build. I'll be using serverless technologies today. Okay, so talking about the project, it's gonna be serverless. So I'll be using AWS for today. So the stack will be AWS Serverless, Lambda functions, and S3. What I want to build is an API to generate QR codes for any of the web link. If you have a URL and you want a QR code for it, you hit this API, which is hosted on Serverless Lambda. You get a QR code. These QR codes will be saved on the S3 bucket. Let's begin. Before I start the project, I am still suffering from the flu, so I have sore throat and I want to make some chai. It has some special elements like fennel and cardamom that helps you soothe the sore throat, and I'll also add honey. Yeah, here's me making chai. So I have my chai ready here and ready to begin my project. Also, let's read today's daily Stoic quote. So today is September 10. So as most of my projects start, we'll start by creating a GitHub repo, and it's almost 9:35. So yeah, let's start with the first working session. Okay, so I think I'm ready to test my Lambda function. So I found the QR code pip library, which is, a Python package, and I feel pretty confident about the Python code that I've written for the Lambda function. So I'll use OBS to show this. So on the top, we have got our inputs, right? So QR code is one of the libraries, and then borrow3, I'll use this to store the generated QR code into the S3 bucket. So basically here I am initializing the borrow3 client for S3, and then we have our main Lambda handler function. We will parse the URL from the event, right? Ideology in my mind is you'll pass URL as JSON body to the Lambda function, and we'll parse that and get the value of the URL, which will be, a link like rishabkumar.com. And then I have the generation of the QR code. So we are using the QR code library here, and the documentation is available if you go to pip and search for QR code, or just search on Google QR code pip package, using that according to the documentation. And also I wanted to generate a unique file name if I want to make this project public, and people will be using it to create several QR codes, right? So I want each and every QR code file name to be unique. And the easy way I found is to use the URL itself as the QR code name. So let's say the URL is rishabkumar.com. The file name will be rishabkumar.com.png. And I'm saving the QR codes as PNG. And then we have the upload. So I'm using the s3.put object here. You can see the bucket is QR code generator 7. This is, again, I just thought of this. So, here it can be any bucket name, whatever you want to name your bucket. I thought I'll name mine QR code generator as per the project name. And then we have some key, body, content type, which is a PNG, ACL, which I had to remember to make it public read, because I want the users, once they send a URL, to be able to look at the PNG file that was created in the S3 bucket, which is the QR code, right? Also, I wanted to generate the URL of the uploaded QR code, which is the S3 object. S3 objects are things that exist in the S3 bucket. So in our case, QR code would be an S3 object. I wanted a publicly accessible URL, which basically follows this convention. S3, whatever the region your bucket is in, .amazonaws.com, the name of the bucket and the file name. Since we are giving the objects public read access, all the files should be accessible on this URL. I'm storing that in a variable called QR code URL, and then the Lambda function returns. After all of this happens, it returns a status code of 200 and gives you a JSON response back saying the QR code was generated and uploaded to S3 bucket successfully. It also gives you that QR code URL, which is the S3 object URL where you can find your QR code. So I hope that makes sense. I think we'll put this to test by creating a Lambda function, uploading our code there, and also creating an S3 bucket. And we'll also have to make sure the Lambda function has proper permissions to put object into S3 bucket and also get bucket location is the other thing that our Lambda function should be able to do. So yeah, we'll have to make sure the IAM rule that's created for our Lambda function has those permissions. Okay, so let's quickly create a Lambda function. We'll name this QR code generator and Python. Sure, I think that's good. We'll give this a runtime of 3.10 for Python. You can choose whatever architecture you want. Let's go with ARM64. For the default execution role, I'll let AWS Lambda create a new role with the basic Lambda permissions, and then we'll add the S3 permissions later. So either I can have an API gateway, and we'll see what I want to do, but you could also have a function URL which will give you an HTTP endpoint where you can test your Lambda function instead of having an API gateway. So for now, just let's create the function. Okay, so we have the QR code generator Python Lambda function ready. As you can see, it has the boilerplate code that AWS gives you, but we want our custom code to be uploaded. And the way to do is, since we are using external packages like QR code, what we'll have to do is install those packages locally and then create a zip folder with all these packages included along with the lambda_function.py file, and then upload that zip to AWS Lambda through the management console. So let's do that. Okay, so as you can see, I did the pip install QR code pill, and the target was the not root but Lambda function directory of this project. So you can see there's a lot of folders that were generated by the pip install, and then I used the compress archive, which is a PowerShell command, which I had to Google because I'm familiar with the Linux side of it, you know, how you can zip folders. But this is the lambda function.zip, as you can see, that has been created for us. We can upload this to our AWS Lambda function in the management console. So I'm in my AWS management console, and you can see, if you're not on the same screen, you can go to functions, and whatever the function you created, it should load the code tab as default, and you can see there is upload from on the right hand side. If I click on that, I can choose a zip file, so I'll do that. So I just selected the lambda_function.zip that we just created, right? Hit save, and this should update our Lambda function, as you can see on the top. There we go. So our Lambda function has been updated with the code that we have written to generate QR codes. Now we can test it. So I'll use the test functionality built within Lambda. Let's call this test event. And sure, let's leave it as hello world. What I want to do is have a JSON with URL as rishabhkumar.com. So basically this should create a QR code for rishabhkumar.com, and make sure to include the whole link. So there we go. Now I can click on save and click test. So the execution failed. As you can see, an error occurred, access denied when calling the put object operation. We still haven't allowed our Lambda function to have access to the S3 bucket. So let me go ahead and quickly create an S3 bucket, and also I'll show how to update the Lambda function permissions. So I've quickly created the QR code generator 7 bucket. As you know, remember that was what was the name of the bucket I decided in the code for my Lambda function. So make sure the name is same. And luckily this was available. Remember that the S3 buckets need to have a unique global name. The only thing that I wanted to point out is the permissions. So objects can be public in this bucket. Remember, we need people to be able to read the QR code file, which will be generated. And in order to do that, it needs to be publicly available. So the objects can be public. And the other thing is that the ACLs are enabled, or also known as access control list, because our S3, our AWS Lambda function gives the new object a public read ACL. It's only able to do that if ACLs are enabled. So these are the two permission related things that I wanted to mention. Everything else was default. And again, I'm using default. Let's go back to our Lambda function. In configuration, you'll see that there is a permissions tab. So click on that and you'll see the role name. So this is the execution role that was generated by default by the Lambda function. And we will edit this to have the necessary S3 permissions. So when you click on the role, you can see under permissions, it only has the basic execution role that was assigned, right? You can add permissions by either creating an inline policy or you can attach policies. So by attach policies, these are some of the AWS managed policies that were created with your AWS account creation in the beginning, right? So these are available by default. You can also do with the inline policy is give your Lambda function a really fine-grained access. Remember, we need get object, but we also need put object, which will let Lambda function write the QR code to S3 bucket. So you can use this as an example and add the put object as an action. Here it says example bucket, so change the name of example bucket to be the QR code generator 7, right? So this will give your Lambda function only the permission to put and get object for the specific S3 bucket, which is what fine-grained access is. Whereas if you go to the other route of attaching a policy, you can see that there is S3 full access policy, S3 read-only access, which will not work for us, right? Because we need the Lambda function to be able to write things to S3. So you could select this and click on add permissions, but I don't suggest that. I would say create an inline policy and only give it the permissions that are necessary for the Lambda function. Okay, so after we have figured out the IAM permissions for our Lambda function, what we can do is go ahead and test our code again. So we'll still go with the test event. This is the URL, click test, and this time it succeeded. We got a status code of 200, and this is the body that we got. We also were able to get the URL for the QR code that was generated. And fingers crossed, let's see if we can access the QR code with the URL that was generated. Awesome. So we did get a QR code, which I guess you can scan it since you're watching this video and tell me if it works. So this should go to rishabhkumar.com. But yeah, our code works as expected. We were able to retrieve the QR code, which is the S3 object, based on the logic we just wrote here. So this actually worked because it is the structure with which the S3 object URLs are generated. So S3-region, which in our case was CA Central 1, the bucket name, and the file name. Awesome. So now what is left is to test it using Postman and maybe curl and see if I can send a post request to my Lambda function and see if it gives back the S3 URL. But before that, what I want to do is create a README for the GitHub repository and also push this code to GitHub so that it's in sync with my repo and is safe somewhere. Okay, so the repo is called AWS-QR-code. I just added a README and an MIT license, right? And the zip is also uploaded with gitignore as well. But now let's test the API functionality, right? The easiest way, as I said, is to give it a function URL, or you can also set up an API gateway. Let's go with the function URL, create function URL. For the auth type, I want none because I want people to be able to publicly send post requests to this URL. So it will generate policy statement for us. That looks good. Click on save, and now you have a function URL which you can send an HTTP request to. So now the only thing left to do is send a post request with a body having a URL. So let's copy our function URL. I'll open Postman here, create a new request, paste that URL, and then we'll click on body. We'll click raw, and the type should be JSON. We can copy our event. So if you go into test, we created a test event. So this is how the body should be. So go back to Postman, paste that in the raw body. There you go. You can see that. Instead of rishabkumar.com, let's do blog.rishabkumar.com. Right. Let's do a post request. So remember to change the request type to post instead of get, and click send. So we got an internal server error. So if I go to bat gateway, I've got some digging to do now because our test event works, right? It was able to generate a QR code. We can also confirm that by going to S3, which we never did, but there you go. There is a rishabkumar.com.png right here. Okay, so the test event works, but sending a post request to the function URL doesn't work. So it's almost 10:30. I think it's a good time to take a break. Okay, so got back from the break. I went out to balcony, did some walk, and then also watered the plants. And I guess it's time for coding again because we have to figure out the issue with the post request as it's not working. So I think I figured it out. This is the Stack Overflow post that I referred to. So I just basically searched that Lambda post request not working, and this was one of the results. So basically the event JSON, so that the one that we use for testing, is not basically same as sending a post request to your Lambda function. So we'll have to modify some of our code in order to handle post request and also be able to pass the URL from the body of the post request. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So currently we have this as the parsing for the URL. So it just looks for event. We get URL from the event type, which is basically this, right? So this is an event. It gets whatever the value of URL is. And this is not same as post request. So let me modify my Lambda function. Okay, so the modification basically is we take the body that's in the post request, we use the JSON library here, and then look for the URL within the body, right? So I think this should help. So we are directly not looking at the event and then the URL property or key. Now we are looking at the body, taking the JSON, and then within that body, we are looking for URL. So I've saved this. Now I have to create an archive, which if I do an up arrow, should work. Oh, so let's use the force flag. It just gave an error saying that the lambda underscore function.zip already exists. Yes, so we'll use the force to overwrite the existing archive. And there we go. Now, if you go back to our Lambda function, go to code, click upload from, and then .zip file, upload, and then we'll upload our zip, click save. Awesome. So let's test it using the event. Again, the rishabkumar.com already exists, but we'll overwrite. So as you can see, we got an error saying it could not find body within the test event. So let's modify this to say body. Okay, so basically this. So I'm also including a header saying the content type is application JSON, just in case, and then a body that has URL and whatever the URL is. So instead of blog, let's keep it rishabkumar.com just for testing it out. Click save. Let's test it again. And it works. Awesome. So it did generate the QR code and it's accessible over this object URL. So now let's go back to Postman and do the same thing, but for blog.rishabkumar.com. And I can show you that within objects, it is not there, right? So it does not exist. So let's go to Postman, make that post request. There we go. So it worked. It gave us a response back. Let's follow this link. We have got a QR code for blog.rishabkumar.com. And again, you can verify it by scanning it. So this should take you to blog.rishabkumar.com. So post requests work. And now basically I can give out this function URL that I have to people, and people can use it to generate QR codes. The only thing is that you have to provide the URL in the body of your API request. So I'd really had fun creating this project. I think the next steps kind of just thinking in my mind would be to have an API gateway instead of the function URL, set up API gateway to handle post requests, and also maybe have some kind of front end. Of course, you can use the API to generate QR codes, but it would be nice if there is front end which would act like a home page, and then also have some UI features where you can enter your URL and click submit, and it would give you the QR code that you can download. That would be the next part. Make sure you comment down if you want me to cover the next part, or should I just code it? So if you want a video on the next part, make sure you comment it down. Also, it would be nice if maybe I can translate this in Azure. So also comment down if you want me to convert this project into like an Azure version. So using Azure functions and storage, right? But yeah, I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.